Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are tuning in to this webinar from. I'm Beth Bierke, the president of the Aviation Accreditation Board International, and excited to kick off our first AABI webinar series. We're hoping to continue to do this throughout the academic year to bring important topics to you, our AABI members. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker of our webinar event, Dr. Will Miller. He is the Associate Vice President for Continuous Improvement and Institutional Performance at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and he has agreed to come in today and present to us on streamlining pathways for faculty qualifications. So with that, Will, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Beth. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. And I'm really excited to be here today. As Beth shared, I'm AVP for Continuous Improvement at Embry-Riddle. And in that role, I oversee our institutional accreditation along with all of our specialized accreditors, including AABI. And, we had AABI on campus this year. We had ABET on campus this year. I've served on an AABI committee this year. I've just finished yesterday a SAC-COC offsite review committee. And faculty qualifications continues to be this large conversation. And areas like aviation tend to bring lots of questions from folks because PhDs in English, I'm just going to pick on English today, on political science, I can pick on political science, don't understand the different levels of qualifications. They don't understand how, folks teaching flight training may or may not have a PhD, and that may or may not be okay. Or in some cases, they may not have finished even their bachelor's degree programs, and they can train in flight. So we need to talk about how we internally track this, how we put it forward for different regulatory bodies, because as much as we've talked about accreditation, we also have other regulators. I'll share today how for the VA, Embry-Riddle had to show some things related to our flight courses and our flight instructors. And then we'll talk through how you can build systems like this. So a lot of it will be what's the lay of the land, what are some specific ideas and examples, and then even more importantly, how can we move closer to this at an institutional level. The Q&A is open, the chat's open. You can feel free to ask questions whenever. I'm not a stickler for let's wait till the end. I might forget by the end. So feel free at any point to I don't want to say interrupt me, but to ask what you're curious about. So what are we going to get out of this session? We're going to talk about different accreditation expectations. SAC-COC and HLC were predominant from the U.S. context in the folks who signed up. There were a few Middle States folks too, but we'll also talk about international bodies. We'll talk about different regulators. We'll talk about how we can document professional experience and how we can help flight hours and licensure and industry roles and experience turn into credible compliance evidence. We'll talk about how to frame credentials effectively. So how do we actually make these connections, and how do we do it to course outcomes? Learning outcome memos are a great way to demonstrate that faculty are prepared and able. And then we'll streamline our processes. We'll talk about how we build sustainable systems that allow us to do this. So hopefully you'll leave with some frameworks, some real world examples, and some ideas. I warned Beth, and I'll share now with you all, my slides today are very text dense compared to what I normally do because I want them to be able to serve as a resource. So don't worry, I won't be reading off of them per se, but you'll see a lot of text, and that was with some intentionality for afterwards. So why do faculty qualification systems matter? And this is, the broader conversation already as people are working their way through. There's changes in accreditation happening. There's changes in regulation. Obviously, if you're U.S. based, we have changes at DOE. We have changes in the VA. SAC-COC has a new president. NETCHI has a new president. WASC has a new president. SAC-COC is rewriting all of their standards. There's lots of questions around what accreditation will look like 2 or 3 years from now at an institutional level. But nobody's out there clamoring and saying, well, just anybody can teach whatever. So it's not like we're looking at faculty qualifications not mattering in the future. If anything, they'll matter even more because it's not just an administrative hurdle. It's something that actually will touch every aspect of health and sustainability for a program. I mean, if you think about the folks that are delivering content, the folks that are designing curriculum, the folks that are, in some way, shape, or form, the true linchpin for student retention and success, we want to make sure they're people we feel confident can do that role. Now, at the same time, the issue I think a lot of institutions have started to run into is folks who don't understand every single discipline, because nobody can necessarily do that, are making processes like this incredibly bureaucratic. And at the end of the day, there's no accreditor out there who's wanting to tell you a faculty member is not qualified. I literally just got done yesterday looking at 3 institutions that between the three had more than 6,000 faculty members. And there was a single faculty member out of those 3 institutions that we said, we really don't think this person's qualified to teach that. The other multiple hundreds that we said, not quite there yet, it was you haven't made the case on why you believe they're qualified. It starts from the institution showing that they want people to be qualified and why they think they're qualified. So much of this conversation is going to focus in on that idea that, as the person in charge of faculty qualifications, if you bring me somebody and say, I think they're capable of teaching this course and I believe that, I start from the presumption of it is my job to help you qualify them, not to be an administrative hurdle in making it more difficult for you. So when qualification systems overemphasize traditional degrees at the expense of expertise, we end up with challenging situations. So that's where we might all of a sudden feel like, I'm tired of filling out learning outcome memos. I don't want to fill out a 60-page justification for why I'm qualified to teach a course so that others would say I'm qualified to teach already. So it's about accreditation compliance. It's about being able to hire and retain folks and faculty morale. Obviously, it impacts credibility and learning outcome success. And it also helps us be more efficient. So if we do this right, we're validating expertise and support. If we don't do it right, which a lot of institutions I think struggle with today, we actually undermine the quality, especially if we over-rely on terminal degrees. So let's talk about AABI to start. Obviously, if you look at, 352, I'll put it at 3 at the bachelor's degrees. AABI is very clear on what we get related to faculty qualifications. The gold would probably be the biggest jump out. Full-time and adjunct faculty directly involved in an aviation program must meet at least the minimum standards for academic credentials specified by the institution and required by the regional or national accrediting agency. And I think this sentence is so important to start the conversation with today because it lays out that number one, for AABI, it's a must. So we know it has some importance to it. But again, it's about showing that the faculty are meeting the standards specified by the institution. So as the institution, we maintain control over what is and isn't going to be ultimately accepted. So that's an important way to think about this is we get to determine what leads to qualification. And as long as it follows some industry norm, we're good. And then it's always about, the regional or national accrediting agency. Regional accrediting agencies are gone in the US. They're institutional at this point. And I know for a lot of our folks in the Middle East, Africa, it's kind of the same situation. But with those groups, it's what are they following? So important to know that with AABI, a lot of this is, CV based. And CVs can work to show that our faculty directly involved in an aviation program meet the minimum standards because AABI is full of aviation folks reviewing aviation faculty. So we understand the intricacies and the differences. If you're sitting before an institutional accreditor and you have me in political science and somebody from a school of education and a chemist, maybe they don't understand why it's different for flight instructors or why it's different in aviation. No differently than they might not understand how it's different for trying to think of other areas, other technical fields, or an MFA or JDs teaching government courses, all sorts of ones where it's just not a direct ad, and that makes it potentially difficult. So important to recognize AABI has an expectation, and I'm saying it's a minimal expectation in the sense of this is the bottom line. We know we have to meet it for AABI, but other accreditors and regulation bodies may actually ask for more and may ask for it in more quick timing. So if we think about the accreditor landscape, and I only have SAC, COC, and HLC here because Middle States falls into kind of the HLC side. The idea of qualified faculty shows up in most accreditors' language somewhere from a standard perspective at the institutional level. Same thing for, again, the international accreditors, whether they're looking for US accreditation or sticking with home nation. This is something they care about. We want to make sure the people that are teaching and rewarding degrees actually are capable of doing that. But if we look at even how vastly different they can be, let's take SAC COC. If you've never interacted with SAC COC before, SAC COC, it's all about faculty roster. If you want to get a sense of what the faculty roster looks like, I'm looking to see where I have one because I swore I had one pulled up. Here's a faculty roster form, and we'll come back to this later. But basically, for all of your faculty at your institution, who are they? What courses are they teaching? What are their academic degrees and coursework? What are their other qualifications and comments? There are reviewers out there in SAC-COC land, I've dealt with one this week, that would go through this entire roster and say, oh, BS degree not qualified, BS not qualified, BS not qualified, because they believe that there's an expectation of at least a master's degree, if not a terminal degree. There's nothing in SAC-COC language that says that's the case. There's a guideline that suggests it might work, but it says it's up to the institution. But for every individual instructor, you create sheets like this, and for an institution of Embry-Riddle size, this turns into a, multi-hundred page document. This is just flight instructors for 1 year, and it's 60 pages. You compare that to somewhere like HLC or Middle States, where it's really a focus not on the individual faculty members, but on institutional policy and process. So they want to know that you have a written policy and procedures that ensure faculty meet the standards you have set as an institution. So it's about systematic implementation. What's good and what's bad about SAC-COC in this case, or accreditors that dig deeper? I'm doing a different type of work, and I would argue more work than maybe HLC or Middle States, but the VA can show up. Another regulator can show up and say, give us all of your faculty members by name and prove to us that they're qualified, or show us that they're qualified. So that could be asked for by anybody. So as we credential faculty to teach courses, especially when they're first coming on board, it's important that we get as granular as we can, even if our accreditors aren't asking for that granularity, so that if they do ask later on, we're not scrambling to figure out what we needed to show or how we needed to show it. So the core tension, at the end of the day, this comes down to degrees versus professional experience. And I am not saying that there are not aviation faculty at every institution that would be qualified just off of degree. But I would argue that there is a question of, do you always want the person with a degree teaching the course? I'll use my own example. Like I said, I'm a political scientist. My background's campaigns and elections and polling. And again, I can't tell you how glad I am to be talking about faculty qualifications versus anything government related at this point. But sure, I have a PhD in it, and I can teach a course on, political polling. But if you have the opportunity to learn it from me or somebody with a bachelor's degree who is national pollster for the Obama campaign, they're probably going to learn more from the guy who actually has done the job. So we have to be able to figure, or woman who's done the job. We need to be able to figure out how this looks different. So we have a unique qualification challenge in the aviation side because, as it says here, certified flight instructor with 3,000 hours, examiner authority, and decades of training may be far more relevant than somebody who has a master's degree or a doctoral degree and next to no cockpit time. But we will have accreditation reviewers when we're not talking to just aviation folks that will think it's the opposite. And that's because degrees are straightforward and degrees are easy. And because degrees are easy, we prefer to look for that because we can verify it through the transcript. We can hold everybody to the same standard. And as an accreditation reviewer, it just makes life simpler. But it's not necessarily serving our programs, our institutions, most importantly, our students, and even more importantly, in the case of aviation, the industry, by having folks learn from those individuals every time. Flight instruction makes it even more unique. And again, every institution sets things up somewhat differently, we know. So I'll just kind of talk from a generic stance, and you can think about how it ties back to yours. You have an instructor tied to the course. That's how traditional systems work. It's great. If I'm teaching Intro to American Government, I teach all of Intro to American Government. I handle everything. Things are nice and simple. Aviation flight instruction in many cases shatters that assumption. So a student enrolls into a single course. There might be, let's say 40, 50, 60 plus flight lessons or modules scheduled across a semester based on weather, aircraft availability, student progress, all of those things. And there might be different flight instructors teaching different lessons to that student in that course based on their schedule or what they're qualified to teach or their availability. So you end up with a many-to-many relationship, which is the exact opposite of the traditional faculty qualification system, which is a one-to-one or a one-to-many. And we have turnover. I think all flight institutions deal with the fact that you have flight instructors that transition. They can transition to airlines. They can transition to private, whatever they want mid-semester, which means agile documentation that adapts to roster changes. It's not like if I said this person will be a flight instructor for this course in September, that's a guarantee they're going to be there in October. Likewise, there might be a new flight instructor teaching in a course in November that wasn't even an employee in October. So just an important distinction that helps us understand this mismatch. So the real important distinction here is the idea of the instructor of record. The instructor of record maintains academic oversight and grading authority, while these lesson instructors are providing specialized flight training. Today, accreditors tend to focus on the course level accountability side, but more and more accreditors are moving towards the person who is the instructor of record is the one who delivers the content. And we'll talk a lot about that from an Embry-Riddle perspective and from a SAC-COC perspective here in a few minutes. But that mismatch between what accreditors are thinking for and our operational reality caused significant friction. We had a situation last year at Embry-Riddle. We were going through VA compliance and working with flight and working with standard terms and non-standard terms. And some of you were probably brought into that conversation. I know Abby was brought into that conversation. But it led to a lot of different questions from the accrediting body where they showed, a lack of familiarity with flight, and they acknowledged a lack of familiarity with flight. We had questions like, well, why can't you fly 24/7? Or why can't students just be kind of forced to go out and fly? It doesn't matter if they're saying they don't feel like it that day or whatever it could be. Or why do you go above and beyond safety expectations? So it's all of these competing questions. And it leads to, again, tensions and misunderstanding that ultimately clear when you talk to folks who know what they're doing. So defining the instructor of record. This sits at the heart of aviation program compliance. Clear instructor of record designations give us the structure that we need. Every accrediting body has a slightly different take on what is an instructor of record today. And that's another problem here, is that we don't have consistency across the board. I'm going to speak to SAC-COC here because SAC-COC actually does have a very clear instructor of record piece available in guidance. HLC, if you're an HLC, you guys obviously have a nice 4 or 5 page colored brochure on faculty qualifications of some of this. But if you read the SAC-COC policy statement, an institution is responsible for identifying the instructor of record. That is the person who provides direct instruction for the course. This person should be qualified to teach the course. Historically, at Embry-Riddle, we had all of our flight instructors. They would be handling the modules within the courses. And then we would have one person listed as the instructor of record who oversaw all of them and entered final grades and designed what they would be doing. And that's how it worked for years and years and years and years. And then instead, last year, we got this letter that I'm just putting up on the screen. That says very clearly for standard 6.2a faculty qualifications, please include a faculty roster for all individuals providing direct instruction for flight airplane courses offered during the previous academic year. Include the minimum qualifications required by the institutions to those teaching assignments. And in that statement, they made it clear that the instructor of record were the flight instructors who are actually in the cockpit with the students, not the full-time faculty member who had historically been listed. And their argument was that is the person who knows if the student is doing what they need to do and ultimately delivering the instruction. And that changes expectations significantly. The instructor of record is supposed to have academic accountability, course learning outcomes, curriculum delivery, assessment alignment, grading. And again, this is another one, grading versus whether students are preparing to take certifications, two different things that blur. Quality oversight. What are we doing in terms of consistency, instructional concerns, these pieces? And then be that point of contact for accreditation purposes. From a documentation level, it ultimately means that we need to be able to show who they are, why they're qualified, what they're qualified to do, and then how they control multiple lesson instructors. And this is where SAC-COC, again, has blurred the line, and we see other accreditors moving in that same direction. And the reason SAC-COC went that route is because the VA went that route. The VA made the argument that we believe the person actually flying with the student should be that, and SAC-COC adapted to it. So we have operational flexibility, but that is a big difference. And it becomes a big difference because we change flight instructors so often. As we have that, I don't want to call it a revolving door because that makes it seem like there's a negative connotation. That's not the reality of what's happening. But instead, is we have them coming and going. It's not like I can say on, August 18th, these are the only flight instructors that could offer FA 221 this year, because some of them are going to leave and some of them are going to come on. So how do I list 100 different flight instructors in our case? Or how do I list 30 if I'm at another institution? It becomes difficult bureaucratically and administratively, but it's what we're being asked to do from an accreditation angle. So what are the pitfalls before we get into how do we get around them and what do we work towards? There's lots to think about from the accreditor angle. And it's what I just talked about earlier. Most accreditation findings when it comes to faculty qualification aren't from unqualified people. They tend to be from, we don't have the right documentation, there's a mismatch, there's a bad process, there's a bad system. There's someone at the institution telling people that they can't use this instructor, even though there's no reason that they can't be used. So the pitfalls tend to be, number one, a degree-only mindset, where people just insist that the degree is the only way to show qualification. Or they make it so much more difficult or so much more painful, it's not worth pushing. And I feel this way every time. If I tell a faculty member or a department chair or a dean, like, hey, I can get this person qualified, but let's do a learning outcome memo. You're going to teach this course. There's 5 course learning outcomes. Tell me for each one how their background has uniquely prepared them to be able to help students make progress on this outcome. I still feel guilty doing it, even though we're trying to help them qualify somebody, because it is more work. And it feels like I'm doubting, the chair who brings me the faculty member or the potential faculty member, when in reality, I'm just trying to dot I's and cross T's. Second pitfall, static documentation. Failing to update qualification records when rosters change or when their qualifications change. So I can tell you with Embry-Riddle, and we'll share more about this as we go through, one of our big issues is obviously part of what qualifies faculty for different components or certifications they have or how many hours they've flown. We track their hours in our official system at the time of hire, but then the more hours that they ultimately accumulate as a flight instructor, we are updating those in a completely separate system. So those hours get updated in ETA. They don't get updated in the faculty qualification system. So it ends up looking like there's a bunch of mismatches, which I can promise you SAC-COC was more than happy and willing to point out to us last year, which forced us to rethink this. Missing connections, not mapping credentials to outcomes or courses in a way that makes it easy for reviewers to check the box. And we'll show you at Riddle how we've kind of worked through checking that box better. And then process complexity. We make things too difficult. It's redundant. It's hard. It's difficult. It's problematic. And if you're at an institution where to show that I'm qualified to teach a course, I'm having to give you, 20 or 30 pages of documentation, we've kind of we've buried the lead. We've lost what really matters in this. We've lost the important part. And that makes it, incredibly difficult because that, we go back to morale and student expectations. It just makes it uncomfortable for everybody. Most of these pitfalls disappear if we have clear written policies, if we have clear templates, and if we have audit cycles that catch the problem before they become a problem, looking at this stuff. Because our goal is not to build a perfect system. We're never going to have the perfect system. We need to have a defensible system, a defendable system. As much as I may sound like I'm harping on, the national accreditors or the regulators or different government bodies, they know aviation programs are unique. They absolutely know that, the same way that nursing programs were unique for so many years. So it's about us applying consistent, reasonable standards with also having documentation trails that let us see that. So let's think about some principles that will help us do this. Number one, fit for purpose evidence. Building systems requires going beyond the transcript. So what do we need to have when we actually think about whether an individual is qualified to teach in a flight course or a flight program? What things might we consider? Academic degrees and transcripts do matter. I will tell you all, and I think it still surprises people on our campus, SAC-COC was completely fine with the fact that we had students that had yet to earn their bachelor's degree, but had flight instructor certifications from the FAA teaching other students. But we had to put into a nice policy and make it clear that, this is acceptable. These are the only things they can teach. This is where their expertise stops. This is what else they have to be doing. But those FAA certs play a role, whether it's their ATP, their A&P, a DP, CFIs, all of these things make a difference, but you have to build around it. Telling a SAC COC reviewer, an HLC reviewer, a VA official, a national official from a foreign government who's looking at your institution that the student has the CFI, so they're fine to teach these 8 courses, means nothing if you're not explaining how that's possible or why that's the thing that matters the most. You might have to explain to get the CFI, they had to do blank, 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 and blank. And the outcomes of these courses tie to those same things from the CFI. And it feels commonplace for us. I should say for you. It's still not commonplace for me. I'm still learning my best on some of the certification sides as the non-aviation person here in some ways. Or I should say the less aviation heavy person here. But in general, you have to dot some of those I's, cross some of those T's, and help make that alignment. It can be flight logs and recency. We need to be able to track time. As they add time, we need to be able to track that somewhere that gets back to the faculty qualification piece. You know, I can call anybody at Embry-Riddle. I could call Parker, I can call Ken Burns, and I could say, you know, an ETA, what does instructor so-and-so have currently? And then I could sit there and put it onto a faculty roster, but that's not systematic. That's one-off. That's person dependent. That's trusting a system that's not an official system of record in some ways for the institution. So that's important. Looking at industry leadership roles, what are they doing? Safety officers, check airmen, director of ops, all of these different pieces can play important roles. Teaching performance matters. You absolutely can use to show faculty qualifications that this person has taught this course for a decade and has strong evaluations, their students pass future courses. You're allowed to use that as part of this. Evidence of teaching effectiveness can be one of the legs of a stool that you ultimately build. And then professional development. What are they doing from, an industry perspective? Are they doing continuing ed? Are they staying active members of their professional community? And if so, what's that helping us see, and what's that helping us ultimately show? So when you think about it, I mean, each evidence category has distinct purposes. This is one I'll read. A chief pilot's operational leadership demonstrates qualification for an AM course, maybe. You're going to have to tell them more than just that. An A&P combined with maintenance facility experience might qualify them for a safety course or systems course. So it's all about matching evidence to outcomes, connecting what they've done to what they'll be teaching, and showing why they're a strong fit for students to benefit. So we have to map evidence. And this is a very rudimentary breakdown of how we can map evidence. And then I'll pull up and show you for Riddle sort of how we do this and what it looks like. But if you think about, collecting these credentials is great. It doesn't mean anything if we're not saying why they're relevant. So if we just think about a mapping framework and how we can go and take a learning outcome memo approach, let's use an example of instrument procedures. The key learning outcome, execute IFR flight planning, navigation, and approach procedures and IMC conditions. So what are we going to use for evidence type? We're going to look at instrument PIC hours plus having a CF2 certificate. And then we look at the minimum standard that we've set for this course, which again, we can go to this level to show faculty qualifications. One of the easiest ways to do this is for you to look at all of your courses and say, this is what we want to see from someone with aviation experience to translate to the master's or doctoral degree. So we'd say more than 100 instrument pick hours, current CF2, and then we can verify that through a logbook extract and an FAA certificate copy. For an aviation system management course, the key learning outcome, analyze safety systems, risk assessment, and SMS implementation in organizations. Here we're saying that we're looking for safety officer experience and a graduate degree. So I want more than 3 years of a safety management role, and I want a master's in aviation or a related field. And again, employment verification in the transcript. Aircraft systems, I want an A&P plus maintenance experience. I want a current A&P, I want more than 5 years of experience. FAA cert, employer letters. Airline ops, evaluate operational planning, crew resource management. I want Part 121 experience plus an ATP, more than 2 years in ops, ATP, easy to verify. So if you notice the structure, we're taking the outcomes to the evidence that we can establish, and this becomes very easy. And all of a sudden, you've made it much simpler for the evaluator the evaluator doesn't necessarily need to know what you mean by pick hours, but they know that you've thought through this and said that's your minimum standard, and they can look at a roster form and be like, oh, that person has the number of hours that they ultimately need to accomplish this. So it's all about justifying the qualifications and making it easy for someone to see, are you meeting those expectations? And at Riddle, we do this with our flight courses especially. And I'll bring this over. So if you look at our flight ops, and this is where it does get more granular, which makes it difficult. We have DB and Prescott. Then if you walk through, we have these different classifications, and it makes it very clear to be these different classifications what you have to have achieved. So, we're moving away from IP1s, but these would be your folks, no degree required. They have a CFI, they have a CF2 airplane, they have a single engine land. But if you want to get up to an IP4, you need all of this. Plus, you need 1,200 hours dual flight instruction given, or 2 years of continuing service, or 1,000. It walks through all of these different components and lets us know that to move into those roles, this is what's expected of you. And then we go a step further and we start to look at course currencies and qualifications, where we can look at, see, by course, what do we actually need? What do we need to accomplish? How do we need to have these? And we build these out in ETA. And then we track instructor total time, so we know what's currently happening there. And we look at a qualification. So what are individual instructors able to teach? They're in 141. Are they able to teach a second or third class? Are they able to go into a higher level class? What modules within a particular course are they able to teach? I'm trying to scroll down. Like here, these are all different modules. Like this person can teach components of 141 and some components of 142, but not all of 142. We're going above and beyond in flight instruction than what the accreditor would want. The accreditor would likely say if they're qualified for any part of 142, they're qualified for 142. So we take that extra step in that granularity, but it's harder to show to an accreditor or a regulator how that's working. And then for the individual instructors, we're going through and tracking. Do they have these things? When was their last flight review? What's their certificate? Do they have an ATP? What's their total flight time? How many hours do they have in piloting command? And then we walk through different courses. When did they become okay for those courses? So if you look at this particular student, they're good for all of 121. They're not good for any of 122. They're good for 221. And they're good for parts of 321 or 326 that I'd have to go back to that currency piece. So we're going above and beyond, and I'm saying we here as a field, in tracking our instructor qualifications than what an accreditor might want, but it's still up to us to match and explain why we're doing it this way. And at Riddle, that's exactly what the reviewers ultimately looked at. They looked at this to look at our IP hours, and then they pulled that roster form, and they wanted to see, if I said this person was functioning as an IP2, does this and this align with what it says an IP2 has to have? And that's where they're looking for that consistency, because I've given them policy that explains why these folks are, qualified in our eyes to teach these courses. So lots of different components, lots of different balls in the air with all of this, but all geared at making sure our students are getting what they need. Streamline documentation workflows. How do we track this? We need to have, a sophisticated qualification system, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an entirely complex process. As the whole, we need workflows that we can do this without taking a ton of effort and make it available. So this starts with, some form of centralized repository. And again, this can be an HR database. It can be SharePoint. It could technically be, ETS. It could be a Google Drive. It could be a lot of different things potentially could meet what we're looking for here. But it's about what works for your institution, is in your institution's infrastructure, or ETA, not ETS, sorry. Or what your faculty qualifications folks are looking for. And I'll show you what we have here in a minute. Some type of standardized form that allows us to look at evidence, that allows us to look at narrative, that allows us to verify credentials, that has clear ownership, that has automated alerts, anything we can do to automate here that lets us know, hey, certificates are expiring, documents are missing, we know SAC-COC is coming, we know the VA is coming, we know AABI is coming, do we have what we need for them? And annually auditing it, looking at these things, figuring out who's there. I mean, in the dream world, it's not an annual audit, it's a pre-term audit where we actually stop and say, hey, before this person goes and teaches this course, are they actually ready for it? Are they okay to teach it? Do we have what we need from a qualification angle? That can be hard from a labor perspective. But again, like I said, this doesn't have to be a big fancy system. If you have something like, watermark portfolio, what's watermark called? Watermark faculty or whatever, the old digital measures, if you have Interfolio, any of those that track faculty activity, you could use it, but it's not required. The hardest part, and I'll show you in the Riddle system, is updating this as things change. So at Riddle, we've built this off web forms. So again, I think we have a good system, but and I'll start by showing you an existing faculty member, and then I'll show you what happens when we build a new one. And I'm in a test site just so everybody knows. And that's mainly to remind myself and anybody from Riddle who's here that I'm not about to break our real system, but I'll pull up our friend Ken, who many of you probably know. So, we have Ken here. Ken has a PhD in business administration, engineering, and technology, and we'll talk about different degrees in a few minutes. An MBA in airline management, has his BS. We click into qualifications. Ken's got, his flight instructor, his flight instructor license, multi-engine, airplane, single engine, has a transport pilot license, and has ground instructor. Now, again, the one thing you can't see here because it doesn't get updated as much as we might want it to is whether these things are current. We know he had them on December 2nd, 2011, July 2016, and July 2022, but are they current? We don't know. And then we have experience. And in some cases, this could mean the number of hours they have. And then we have all the courses Ken's credentialed to teach, and who credentialed them, and when we credentialed him, and what that ultimately looked like. Now, as I said, building this out is where it takes a little more time and intentionality. But if I go in to build a new faculty member, and why is it not? Oh, there we go. Let's see if it'll let me build myself. I forget if I'm here. I'll build myself. So that's me, and that's my home department. I love that they put political science and emergency, disaster, and global security studies. It's where we belong. PhD, master's, bachelor's degrees, qualifications. No qualifications here, except an internal training. I could easily add that in. I could add more experience, I could add more courses, but I would build that all in my faculty profile. The administration would build that out for me, and then I'd assign this to a particular group. And let me actually put myself into the College of Aviation and say that we're going to qualify me for something. I could save and continue, and then it would create a task letting him know that I want to be qualified into a new area. And he will not actually get an email about that, by the way. So it's not a hard part. And if I want to show you guys even one step more on this, let me show you from a worldwide angle how we actually build these out to show those qualifications. The hard part, as I said, obviously, is our flight people, and I'm guessing a lot of your institutions are in the same boat, have no problem knowing what current hours are for folks or for instructors, but you might not be reporting that back to a university central system to allow them to see the same. So I'll come back to this once that loads. But important to be able to think about how to build a system that makes this easy. Transparent policy and audit trail, make this simple. So we think about policy language here, especially for HLC and middle states institutions in the US, where you're having to build it off of the policy. That's an incredibly important piece. So we evaluate faculty qualifications, we use the totality of evidence, we map them to course outcomes and lesson objectives. For flight courses, we believe this, this, and this. We maintain these documentations, and we share the different evidence types. We share how we evaluate. We share what we require. We share how often we check this. And most importantly, we tie qualifications directly back to what we expect those qualifications to translate to from a learning outcome perspective. So we want to have that type of clear policy statement, but it's recognizing here as well that you could easily go course by course and say, this is what we want to see. So again, if I go to the Riddle example, if they matched perfectly, I could say you have to be an IP5 to teach these 4 courses, and that would make it very clear and obvious why that's the case. The way it ultimately works in practice, due to the number of lessons or modules within each course, means it's only partial, and we have to explain that, but that goes a far way. So it's not just what you say you're going to do, it's demonstrating that you actually follow through with it. And it starts with clear policy. And every institution has the right to write their own credentialing policy to say, for these courses, we believe this. For these courses, we believe something else. And if you look, there that have this almost mapped out for everybody to see. I'm looking to see really fast on another screen. I should have had this pulled up if one actually has it still available like they used to, because the College of Charleston used to actually make publicly available all of their faculty qualification agreements that would ultimately be signed by the provost, the dean, and others. So if I'm looking, is this it? It's not, but they basically have signed memos that say, for these courses, we believe these are the credentials, qualifications that they have to have. And it makes it very easy for reviewers to know, okay, they're thinking about this seriously, they are in line with industry, etc. So practical tools, what all can you use here? The more practical the tools, the easier it becomes, because we don't want this to be a burden on faculty. I mean, flight instructors or aviation instructors should not be doing extra work that other faculty aren't having to do just because they're in a field like aviation. No way, same way that engineers shouldn't have to do anything different. Nurses shouldn't have to do anything different. Teachers shouldn't have to do anything different. Some of this can be faculty CV extracts. I mean, obviously for ABI, you need to have the CVs, which should make it easier for you to then pull a lot of this type of information if you're requiring your faculty to update their CVs. We need to have some type of form. And again, like I said, that can be SharePoint, that can be Google, that can be a Qualtrics survey, or it can be a system like I showed you from Riddle that's built out. A justification template, help them understand how to write these things or write them for them. And then that mapping table, like I showed the 3 examples from, that lay out the learning outcomes, the evidence types, how we're going to verify, what notes there are. And this takes everything from judgment calls, which they shouldn't be, to something that's more aligned, with what they're expecting to ultimately see. And I saw the question come in from Barris. So the online panel is for itself. Now, again, that's one that we built using web dynamic tools, so that's not a hard build necessarily. So that's one that people could absolutely build independently. It's not dependent on, buying a high expensive software. You need a little programming knowledge, but we're actually redoing it right now, so I can share more on that offline too. And then we think about case studies. I don't want to get into a ton of case studies, but the frequent ones that we have found cause us problems with either regulators or accrediting bodies. We have all sorts of different examples. So, we have examples like this where it's what's the professional credentials? Somebody's an ATP, CFI, CFI2, MEI, they're DPE. They have all of these flight hours. They were a former regional airline captain. They were a CFI at a Part 141. They have an active DPE, 12 years of flight instruction, consistently high student pass rates on check rides, positive peer and student evaluations. And if that person is teaching AVIA 250 commercial flight operations and only has a bachelor's degree in professional aviation, I have seen SAC-COC reviewers say they're not qualified. I have also seen, unfortunately, institutions themselves tell departments that person's not qualified. And what's missing here again is the narrative that helps it make sense to the non-aviation person. We live in a bubble in aviation where this makes, you guys would all probably look at this. Number one, and you'd probably say, something's missing or something's wrong on the number of hours or whatever. You go a level deeper because you know that. But if I'm sitting there with a PhD in fine arts, or let's say I'm sitting there with an MFA, this is foreign. And I'm like, okay, well, that's all impressive and everything, but they only have a bachelor's degree, and I thought you had to have a master's degree to teach this course or to teach something. So important for us to be able to track and know. And we'll talk about other examples people have later. But for this, what you might want to do is think about a qualification justification, mapping the course outcomes. That course requires students to master systems, commercial maneuvers, decision-making under pressure. So combined between what we're expecting with their airline experience and what you're seeing from their professional background, it exceeds the terminal degree alone, which would be specific, of course. But we would want something in policy that says that's what we're looking for. Professional qualifications at the end of the day aren't replacing academic standards. They ultimately complement them. So this case would work because we know there are course-specific needs and that this person actually meets it. However, if you simply said this person has industry experience, That's not enough. We have to raise to that level of how does their industry experience directly translate. Case study 2, and this is one that's even more problematic, I think. The person has the terminal degree or a terminal degree in something else. I've seen a lot of institutions that have transparently just misinterpreted this. Somebody has a JD, but they have, a focus on transportation law, that's perfectly fine. If somebody has an EDD and a master's in aviation and wants to teach doctoral level aviation work, that is completely fine. Anything can be completely fine if, as an institution, you map the case for why, from a learning outcome perspective, this person has the experience to offer that course and adequately prepare students to move forward in it. And you shouldn't have to be doing that through, thousands of pages of portfolios. That's working against the idea of us being here to help qualify faculty that our other faculty and academic leaders believe should be. So, in this case, it's an easy one. If it's an aviation law and regulation course and they have a JD, here's all of this information. We could give all of this detail. We could go through all of this. We could show the JD transcript. We could show practice verification. We could show private pilot certificates, whatever it might be. Or we could write in our policy that AVIA 450, the JD is considered the terminal degree due to the legal practice. And then we are applying our own policy based on best practices, and we could avoid this. So there's multiple paths to take towards showing those qualifications, and we need to remember that. Avoiding red flags. What are the red flags? And I'll go a little quick here on the wrap up so we can have time for questions. Broken evidence chain, no different than the legal system. This is a big one. You list the credentials without the connection. We will have people regularly when I do accreditation reviews for institutional accreditors or for DOE that will sit and just tell us, hey, here's this. And let's be honest, the Embry-Riddle one's as guilty of this as anybody. If I were to just turn this in and all I had listed were, IP2, which nobody knows what that is because it's internal, and flight instructor in this and total flight time, nobody would know if that's adequate or not if I hadn't also in narrative said, this is what this means and this is how it works. So you need to show them the mapping. Show them how you want them to check whether your faculty are qualified or not. Expired certificates. I'm not saying that an expired FAA certificate means a faculty member can't be teaching a course, but you want to make sure that policy or what you're looking at establishes that that's okay. Claiming credentials without supporting documentation. And one of the hardest parts with SAC-COC is I went through for all of those flight instructors on that 60-page document and pulled all of their active certificates with numbers and provided them to SACs just so it was clear. Ambiguity in the instructor of record. And again, this is a hard part because accreditors are moving in different ways. HLC, for example, would never see a teaching assistant as being an instructor of record. In SAC-COC today, based on their latest policy guidance, it would say that if the TA is delivering most of the content, they're the instructor of record. Documentation awareness gaps. Instructors being unaware of what evidence they have to maintain. So you want to have a process around this so you get it all at the start. And then possibly the most important and the most frustrating, the regulatory overlap ignorance. And this is, if we go back to the very beginning where it gets tough, ABI is good with the CV because it shows the information and aviation folks can understand. Other regulators might need more, whether it's the VA, whether it's a state authorizing body, whether it's any other group at this point, and Lord only knows who might ask. It could be your state. I know there's states that are digging more into what's aviation and how's it different and how's it the same. So just make sure you're mapping this across all of these and make sure you're putting the time into auditing it so you know where your folks are and aren't likely to be found qualified. How do we build in? There's a human element to this. I'm talking about all of this stuff today like it's just, us dealing with, kind of monoliths without feelings. We're talking about human beings. We need to recognize that when we're talking about qualification documentation, it's about acknowledging expertise. It's not saying you're not capable. We have to explain why we have to do this and what it looks like. And I can tell you, nobody on my campus enjoys sitting down to talk about faculty qualifications. I'm thrilled that there are still 32 of us here, including myself, talking about faculty qualifications today, because for someone who doesn't have to live in it, it's a very boring topic. And it's a very bureaucratic topic. And it's a very, it seems ridiculous in some ways. I have a lot of faculty, or a lot of deans that'll be like, well, I'm saying they're qualified, so why isn't that enough? So, being able to explain the why is huge. Simplifying participation, but also celebrating credentials. Let's share these things. Let's talk about them. Let's put them out instead of just terminal degrees. it's tough because, for us at Riddle, our websites pull terminal degrees. When we get Watermark's faculty portfolio thing up and running fully, it'll change a little bit. But today it pulls degrees. So if I'm not degree qualified, you're relying on me to kind of update that myself. So how can you do this? If you're sitting there right now saying, I don't know how to even make this happen, what can it look like? And it's important to note that it starts with getting people together, looking at your current policies, and figuring out what your institution's approach to qualifications is. Different institutions have different cultures around this and different personalities. Um, that's a struggle point for sure. Thinking about your policy, thinking about systems and tools that can do this, and then starting to launch. And you might be, part way through on these components, but you ultimately want to get to something that you have to maintain. And I suggested it over, a 6-month process. It might take, you might know for your institution it's going to be 2 years. You might know you're already doing part of this, and it's just, getting it closer. I will say executive sponsorship matters here. You have to have high-level folks on board that care about compliance. And I also saw Dave's Q&A question asked me about changing the instructor of record down to the individual flight instructor when they can change often. How do you keep that up to date? Dave, that's the part we're still figuring out. Right now, we're doing it through 2 systems, which I don't like because we need to be able to figure out how to get ETA data directly into that qualification system because it's sure is not going to be the flight instructor's job to do that. And we need the systems to figure out how to talk to each other to do it. So it's all in one place when we pull those roster forms. Bigger picture, why does it matter? Operational efficiency. It raises morale. It makes things easier. It gives us better student outcomes. It helps our institution be viewed as credible. It makes accreditation easier. And at the end of the day, it emphasizes trust. Faculty need to trust their expertise is recognized. We need to trust that the faculty we're hiring are qualified, and accreditors need to trust that we're doing what we say we're going to do. That's what matters the most. We're doing what we tell them we think matters to have qualified instructors. Key takeaways, number 1, master your accreditor's language. Know what they're looking for. Know why they're looking for it. And know that groups like the VA, state authorization, state governments, if you're international, multi-level bodies, different government organizations can ask for different pieces. So build to the highest common standard, which tends to be the least common denominator. Build to the most granular piece you can. Balance that agrees with professional experience. If you're in an institution where your person who's making these judgment calls is still relying on terminal degree first, they are not in line with the national accrediting bodies anymore. The national accrediting bodies have moved beyond that in a significant way. And it's important, put them in contact with me. I'll talk to them and take the bullet if you don't want to. But we have to have those conversations and be willing to say, we've moved past that. Simplify documentation and tell the story of excellence. Make it about excellence. And this is all stuff that can kind of sit on the slides. So with that, let's open it up for questions. I think I left us about 5 minutes. Beth, I hope I've delivered what we were planning on. And I'll go to this slide just so people can have my contact information somewhere on here. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts.
I think it was a great presentation. Well, thank you so much. And having had the opportunity to serve on a SACS visit about 10 years ago at Embry-Riddle, I got to see firsthand that disconnect between, the accreditors and not having that aviation knowledge. So one thing I will encourage to all of our members that are out there, if you ever have the opportunity to serve on a national institutional accrediting visit like that, especially to another AABI school, please do it because it can make all the difference. I'll also just add that, we talked a lot about accreditors, but just last week at my home institution, I was dealing with our state board of higher education and faculty qualifications too. So again, there are a number of different audiences that it does take education on our part to keep them informed, and hopefully working together as AABI too, we can help kind of make a common language that is understandable. And this was a great start. So there is the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have any questions for Will, please do chime in. I know he's answered some as we've gone. One of the first questions that came in asked about a recording of this presentation. It is my goal to get this posted on our AABI YouTube channel and into our AABI Info Hub, along with a copy of Will's slides. My goal is by the end of this week. Once that happens, I will send a message out to all the attendees that registered, just so you know it is there. So if there are other individuals at your institution that you would like to share this information from, you'll be able to easily do that once we get that posted. So
And I
Any?
will say, Beth, it's funny when you mentioned the SAC COC piece. As I shared with this group, I mean, we had our back and forth with SACs last year just because of some VA pieces. Um, and they got very granular. I mean, I'll put it on the screen where, I mean, they got into, you said this many hours and it was this. So you can see they applied what we asked for. Um, but they still didn't understand the larger piece of flight. And what they had to do was get a special reviewer who was aviation focused to come in and explain to the SAC COC board what their take was on whether we were compliant with these standards or not. Which I will say, I was very glad they made that choice instead of relying on non-aviation folks, but it also shows how important it is to follow exactly what you're doing, because the biggest thing we needed to change was just starting with more things written down. We just had to start with more written policy, which felt redundant, but made it much easier for them to say, oh, good, you're doing what you said, and it makes sense. So
Yeah, I think the one that sticks out with me was actually a maintenance. They had Embry-Riddle had an A&P mechanic with a master's degree, and they were hemming and hawing that they didn't have that terminal degree. And I was like, this is amazing. You know, they have a master's degree and an A&P and a teaching record. This would be fantastic at any institution. And so they were
I
able to move on. But again, it had me being there with that aviation background for them to connect those dots. But that was,
say,
that
and
was
at this
quite a
point,
while ago and pre your time there, Will.
I'd do anything to find somebody for AMS with a master's degree that was willing to come for what we're paying. Uh,
Exactly. Well, great. Well, again, I want to thank you so much for everyone taking the time to join us today, but especially for Will for providing his expertise. I know I've already tagged Will to join us in part of our accreditation development series at our upcoming AABI annual meeting. So I want to encourage those of you, if you haven't taken a look at our website, we do have our preliminary agenda posted out there. We are looking to do our accreditation seminar all day Monday prior to the start of the official conference. Tuesday, we'll be focusing on different topics based in the AABI criteria, with faculty being one of those, along with everything that is found in the criteria. We'll be doing our annual Industry Educator Forum Wednesday, hosted by Jacksonville University. And then on Thursday, we'll be having our committee meetings and our AABI board meetings. So I encourage you all to take a look and sign up to join us in Jacksonville, Florida in February 16th through the 19th. And again, this is our first AABI webinar series. It's a way for us to give more value and communication and information out to our members. We hope to continue this throughout the year, ideally quarterly. So if you have any topics of interest that you would like for us to be able to focus on, by all means, send them our way, and we'll hopefully find experts like Will to join us to provide some of that information and guidance. So again, thank you all for attending today, and thank you, Will.
Thanks, everybody.